Assalamu alaikum, and I want to thank MAS-ICNA for organizing this very timely panel on one of the most pressing issues in Middle East today. And as you heard from the two previous speakers, we heard about Palestine and we heard about Syria. And I will tell a little bit about the story of Turkey and what is happening in Turkey for the last couple of years. It is now a well-known fact that Turkey is passing through probably one of the most challenging periods of its history. And most of these challenges are arising from the region that it locates, actually. Since the war in Iraq in 2003, the region has been in constant instability and difficulties and significant humanitarian problems. More recently, with the beginning of the crisis in Syria, the instability reached to a new level. The emergence of two failed states alongside its borders has significantly limited Turkey's contribution to the peace, stability, and prosperity in the region. When we look at the last decade, I don't want to go into history, but since between 2003 till the beginning of the crisis in Syria, Turkish state tried to lead various initiatives to bring peace to the region and engage all forms of attempts to peacefully resolve the conflicts in the Middle East. This policy even continued when the crisis in Syria began. The Turkish government one more time tried to resolve the problem through intense negotiations and dialogue. However, the Syrian crisis became a huge humanitarian tragedy in 5 years. The crisis in Syria, as the previous speakers mentioned, so far led to the death of 500,000 people. 13 out of 20 million Syrian citizens have become dependent on humanitarian assistance, and 7 million become displaced from their homes. All international norms and laws have been violated by the regime, which has committed the worst type of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The use of chemical weapons in 2003 was not only a breach of the red line of President Obama, it was a breach for all of the major humanitarian principles and laws in the world. Lack of any significant response to this breach of international norms has created an emboldened regime and an increasing level of atrocities directed towards Syrian civilians. With the spread of the conflict to Iraq, today we have two failed states, an unprecedented degree of atrocities, a major humanitarian tragedy, and numerous terrorist organizations alongside Turkey's borders. In the midst of this growing regional insecurity, Turkey acted as the humanitarian haven for the people fleeing the many threats to their life and security. From the very beginning, Turkish government endorsed the idea of safe zone to protect the internally displaced people whose lives were and still are at risk. While the international community acted incredibly irresponsibly and looked the other way, the Turkish government opened its borders. In a remarkable manner, Turkish people welcomed millions of Syrians to their cities, towns, neighborhoods, and even to their houses. Syrians running away from the atrocities of the regime, the brutality of regime-backed militia, the violence of ISIS, and the demographic engineering attempts of YPG all find refuge in Turkey. Only in one example, during the Kobani crisis, what we see is in less than 3 days, 200,000 Syrians entered Turkey. And I happened to be in Suruç, in the border town of Kobani in that critical moment. And I see the humanitarian relief effort by the NGOs, by the Turkish Crescent, and by the Disaster Management Authority of Turkey. Despite the shelling coming from the other side of the border, the support and the humanitarian work never stopped in those dangerous times. It wasn't only Syria. Later, when ISIS attacked the Iraqi cities, we see that Yazidis, Arabs, Turkomans, all of them again seek refuge in Turkey. The flow of these refugees led probably one of the biggest humanitarian operations in the region for decades. Refugee camps, which are now considered as one of the best in the world, was established alongside the border. And according to Global Humanitarian Aid Report, Turkey became the second largest contributor to humanitarian relief and the most generous country in the world. In the past 5 years, Syrian refugees, the number of Syrian refugees has risen to 3 million. 180,000 Syrian babies were born in Turkey. In just one example, in the city of Kiliç, whose original population is around 80,000, 120,000 Syrian refugees seek refuge in one single city. So the population of Kiliç is right now 200,000. And I happened to be there when ISIS organized one of the worst Katyusha rocket attacks to Kiliç. And I see that despite the terrorist attack and despite the death of several residents of Kiliç, the people of Kiliç were acting so mature, they were acting so prudent, they know who is terrorist and who is refugee, and they know who came from the fear of those terrorists from Syria. So far, Turkey has allocated at least $20 billion. And considering the budget of Turkey and its economy, this is huge. So far, the total amount that international community provided for the Syrian refugees in Turkey is around 500 million. Today, Turkey provides healthcare services and medicines to all Syrian refugees, registered Syrian refugees, free of charge. 500,000 Syrian kids are now being educated in Turkish schools. It was great historic responsibility Turkey assumed during this crisis. But this was not only crisis that Turkey has to deal with. While Turkey was dealing with these external challenges without any international support, the security fallout from the Syrian conflict started to impact the security of Turkey as well. After the rise of ISIS in Syria, two different threats started to directly affect Turkey's security. On the one hand is YPG, a branch of PKK, a terrorist organization, internationally recognized terrorist organization by the EU, US, and United Nations. Emboldened with the support of the international coalition for the YPG, its main branch, PKK, relaunched its terror campaign against Turkey in July 2015. So far, hundreds of innocent civilians lost their lives. In the meantime, ISIS also organized and conducted probably one of the deadliest attacks in the city centers of Turkey. Unfortunately, the attacks by ISIS and PKK didn't generate the same type of empathy for Turkey that other attacks generated around the world. While PKK continued its attacks against Turkey, the international coalition continued to support YPG, its surrogate. And the lack of intelligence cooperation from other countries hindered significantly Turkish efforts to stop attacks by ISIS. A year after the beginning of these attacks from two different terrorist organizations, the people of Turkey were shocked by another major incident in July 2016. By now, probably you all heard about this and you all know the details of what happened in July 15 night in Turkey. However, let me tell you a few words before concluding my speech. In order to understand the extent of violence of the July 15 coup in Turkey, you have to look at the history. Yes, in Turkey there are different military coups. Some of them were very brutal. Even the prime minister of the country executed in 1960 military intervention. However, for the last decade or so, because of the democratic reforms in Turkey and because of the active civilian control of the military, many Turks started to assume that there will never be a military intervention to politics anymore. But on July 15, things changed suddenly. Without doubt now, July 15 coup attempt was the most violent coup attempt that we have ever faced in Turkey. Organized by officers loyal to Gülen Group, which had been considered as a national security threat, the coup from the very beginning didn't want to get the public support because the coup makers knew that it is very hard to challenge the legitimacy of a government that just won the election 7 months ago with almost 50% of the popular vote in an election that has 86% voter turnout. So what happened? Instead of gaining public support, the coup makers decided to crack down any opposition from the coup from the first moment. The coup plotters in their declaration even didn't explain and clarify why they were trying to overthrow a democratically elected government. In a very orientalistic tone, the statement referred to Turkey's deteriorating image around the world. The statement repeatedly promised increased cooperation with the Western countries. And in a very partisan manner that has never seen before, the statement targeted the president of the country. There wasn't even an attempt to show that it was organized for well-being, security, and prosperity of the people in Turkey. If you see the photo exhibition just outside this hall, you probably see that there are many sad stories about the victims of this violence. As well as bombing the parliament and police headquarters, the officers also targeted civilians. Ali Anar, for instance, a father of 6, was one of the first victims in Kazan, a town of Ankara. Erol Olçok, one of the advisors of the President Erdogan, was killed, together with his son, who was only 16 years old. Despite the level of violence committed by the coup plotters, Turkish citizens demonstrated an unprecedented heroism on the streets of major cities in Turkey that night. You may all remember the iconic scene from June 1989 in China. In Beijing Tiananmen Square, there was a tank man who was trying to stop a tank to stop the crackdown of the protesters in Tiananmen incident. So we had so many tank men and tank women on the streets on the July 15th. One of them, for example, Metin Doğan, lay down in front of the tanks at Istanbul airport in order to stop the military to total takeover of the airport. Safiye Bayat, a mother of 2, was in the front line challenging the tanks and military vehicles in Istanbul. In other instances, tanks drove over the people who were trying to stop them, but couldn't end their determination. Sabri Ünal, a 34-year-old academic, was wounded after 2 tanks went over him while he was trying to stop the tanks. Despite all forms of provocations by some officers, Turkish people avoided using any form of violent methods in that night. In this tragic time, Turkish people, especially the youth, utilized many forms of innovative methods to stop the military. At that night, how to stop a tank was the most searched item on Google. They were communicating on Twitter on how to stop the military vehicles. There were even attempts by the civilians to stop the planes to take off. For example, in Kazan again, farmers who have farms around the air bases set the harvest on fire in order to make it difficult for the jet fighters to take off. Civilians established roadblocks around the airbase to stop any support to the military within the headquarters. Elderly women and men who are in their 70s went in front of the military headquarters to talk and try to convince the soldiers to change their mind. There was a widespread belief among the civilians that they had the higher moral and psychological authority. They firmly believed that they are being on the right side of the history. The dedication of the Turkish civilians to protect their democracy, the commitment of the youth to save their future, and the passion of the people on the street to resist the possibility of a military junta has seldom been seen before. Probably the Turkish people and their resistance will become a source of motivation in civil-military relations in different parts of the world from now on. The societal resistance against the coup will probably be a source of inspiration in many countries. It will be an exemplar case for the civilian power and the resistance to the military coup and coup attempts around the world. As I mentioned, in the last 18 months, Turkish people faced a series of attacks, challenges that many countries in the West have not experienced in the last 5 or 6 decades of their history. Despite all this, however, Turkey is trying not to forego the responsibilities that it assumed since the beginning of the crisis in Syria. The people in Turkey didn't even have opportunity to cope with the grief of the coup attempt. Shortly after the coup attempt, the situation in Aleppo went worse. Just a few weeks after the coup attempt, when the picture of Omran baby showed up in the first page of the newspapers, it was the Turkish people, Turkish government, and civil society organizations who tried to raise international awareness of the situation in Aleppo. This was the second time that the world seemed to understand the extent of humanitarian tragedy in Syria. First time it was Aylan Kurdi's picture laying on the shore of the Aegean Sea that created a huge reaction in the Western world. However, again, the reactions for the Omran baby was limited and temporary. In the past month, when the regime and its allies siege and attack Aleppo, Turkish people and the government once again took action in the international arena and in the humanitarian realm to alleviate the extent of the tragedy. In the past month, after intense diplomatic negotiations, Turkey achieved to craft an agreement to launch a process of evacuation of the civilians and to provide ceasefire. So far, 50,000 of Syrian Syrians have been evacuated to the northern city of Syrian city of Idlib. Turkish Crescent, again the Disaster Management Authority, together with Turkish non-governmental organizations, are working to ease the ongoing humanitarian crisis. Turkish government also recently started to expand the refugee camps in the case of any attacks to Idlib or any kind of need to relocate the Syrian refugees. So to sum up, I know my time is almost over. Turkey is today helping the people from Syria while being attacked from groups like PKK. It is trying to fight against ISIS in northern Syria and control its very long borders while being attacked by ISIS and not being supported by international coalition. It is trying to deal with the threat to its democracy and security while trying to reform and restructure its state establishment after the coup attempt by the Gülenist officers. It is so far standing strong and firm, but under these circumstances, Turkey also needs the support of international community more than ever. It needs the support of international community to fight against terrorism in its many forms. It needs the support of international community to handle the Syrian refugee crisis. In the absence of such a solidarity and international understanding of the urgency, Turkey will not stop acting in accordance with its principles and to stop the humanitarian tragedy. However, in the absence of it, the international community will face a significant risk of expanding instability in the Middle East and a new wave of humanitarian tragedy that will be more shameful for the international system more than ever. Thank you very much.